The sound came before anything else. A single crack, sharp and final like a branch snapping under the weight of a winter that had been building for years. It cut across the drill yard and hit the far wall of the observation tower, and for one suspended moment, the formation forgot how to breathe. Then silence. Not the silence of an empty room. The silence of a crowd that has just watched something irreversible happen. The kind that doesn't come from fear. The kind that comes right before everything changes. That sound, that moment, that yard. We'll come back to it. But to understand what happened on that drill field at Fort Braddock, Texas on a Tuesday morning in late spring, you have to go back further. You have to understand the woman standing at the center of it. You have to understand the man across from her. And you have to understand the system that put them both there. A system that had been running quietly, efficiently, and without consequence for a very long time. This is not a story about a fight. It is a story about what happens when a person decides that silence is no longer something they can afford. When the cost of staying quiet finally exceeds the cost of speaking up. When one soldier standing in front of hundreds chooses to be the person that no one else had been willing to be. By the time this story ends, a colonel with 30 years of service will be stripped of his rank in a public military hearing that hadn't happened in over 2 decades. More than 30 formal complaints buried across 8 years of careful paperwork and strategic reassignments will finally see daylight. In the case of one soldier, a woman named Elise Novak, who left Fort Braddock quietly in the summer of 2019 and was dead 3 weeks later, will be reopened by federal investigators. But we begin as most true things begin, not with a dramatic confrontation. We begin with a phone call. It was 10:30 at night in San Antonio when Maya Cole's father picked up on the second ring. She was sitting on the edge of her bed in temporary quarters, at the edge of the base, still in uniform, her boots still laced. On the small desk beside her sat a notebook, black cover spiral bound, completely empty. She had bought it that afternoon at the base exchange and hadn't written a single word in it yet. Her father's voice was slower than she remembered. The cough that came after his greeting was new. She didn't ask about it directly. That wasn't how they talked. Fort Braddock, he said. It wasn't a question. He had been in the Marines for 22 years. He knew the name. Yes, sir. A pause, the sound of him settling into a chair. Harlan's still running it. Yes, sir. Another pause longer. Is it worth it, Maya? She didn't answer right away. She looked at the empty notebook on the desk. She looked at her reflection in the dark window across the room. 32 years old, 3 combat tours, a scar on her left shoulder that pulled slightly when the weather turned cold. Tomorrow morning, she would walk onto a base where she had already been identified as a problem, not because of anything she had done, but because of what she represented. I'll call you Sunday, she said. She hung up, sat in the quiet for a long moment. Then she picked up the notebook, opened it to the first page, and wrote the date. That was how it started. To understand Richard Harlan, you have to go back to the Gulf War. Not the version sanitized into textbook summaries, but the actual thing. The sand and the heat and the specific terror of the first night of a ground offensive when you are 26 years old and not sure if the people around you are going to make it to morning. Harlan was a first lieutenant in 1991. He was lean-focused, the kind of young officer who memorized the field manual on his own time and ran 5 miles before anyone else was awake. On the second night of the ground campaign, his unit took fire from a position they hadn't anticipated. 3 of his soldiers were pinned behind an overturned vehicle in the open desert less than 200 meters from the source of the fire. He went back for them, without being ordered to, without hesitation. He moved low and fast across open ground, put himself between the fire and his men, and held that position until the threat was neutralized. All 3 of those soldiers came home. One of them named his son after Harlan. That man existed. That man was real. He earned what he was given, every commendation, every promotion, every handshake from every general who looked him in the eye and said, well done. The problem with power is not that it changes people overnight. The problem is that it changes them slowly over many years in increments so small that by the time the change is visible, it has already become permanent. Harlan spent 30 years in an environment where his word was final, where a look from him was enough to end a conversation, where the people around him, subordinates, peers, even some superiors, had learned that challenging him was a transaction with a cost most people were unwilling to pay. He didn't become cruel all at once. He became accustomed, and accustomed over enough time becomes something very difficult to distinguish from entitled. By the time Maya Cole arrived at Fort Braddock, Richard Harlan was 58 years old, still physically imposing, still sharp in his formal briefings, and completely certain in the way that men who have never been seriously challenged become certain that he understood exactly how things should work and exactly what kind of officer deserved to stand in his command. He had never once considered that the answer might not be him. The morning briefing for incoming officers began at 0800. Maya was in the third row. 14 officers, total a mix of transfers and fresh promotions. Harlan moved through the room with the unhurried authority of someone who had been doing this for decades and saw no reason to adjust his pace for anyone. He picked up her file before he reached her. He didn't open it. He looked at the cover, at her name, at the deployment stamps, at the commendation tabs. Then he set it down on the table and moved past her with a slight pause, just long enough for his voice to carry to the row behind her. Another decorated transfer, he said, just under conversational volume. We'll see if the field made you tough or just stubborn. He didn't look at her when he said it. He was already 2 steps past her chair. Maya did not flinch. She did not look up. She did not change her expression by even a fraction. She looked at the table in front of her, and in her mind she was perfectly still, the way she had learned to be still in a vehicle waiting at a checkpoint in Kandahar, where stillness was the only thing standing between a bad situation and a catastrophic one. Then when Harlan had moved to the front of the room and begun addressing the full group, she reached into her jacket, took out the black notebook, and opened it to the first page. She wrote the date. Then she wrote 4 words beneath it. She wrote, "He knows I'm here." Staff Sergeant Dex Owens had been at Fort Braddock for 11 of his 15 years in the Army. He was not a large man, but he had the kind of physical stillness that takes years to develop, the stillness of someone who has learned that the most important information in any room arrives in the spaces between what people say out loud. He found Maya 3 days after her arrival at the tail end of a maintenance inspection near the South Motor Pool. He didn't approach her directly. He fell into step beside her as she was leaving, the way you fall into step beside someone when you don't want it to look like a meeting. 11 years I've been watching this place, he said without looking at her. You know what I've learned? She kept walking. Tell me. The ones who see it clearly in the first week, he said, are always the most dangerous to him. She said nothing. They walked past a row of trucks through a patch of shade back into the sun. There's something you need to see, Owen said. He reached into the left breast pocket of his uniform and produced a single folded sheet of paper. He held it out without slowing his pace. She took it without breaking stride. She looked at it later alone in her quarters, door closed. It was a printed copy of an internal email chain. The formatting was standard Army administrative correspondence. The date at the top was 11 weeks earlier. The chain originated from the office of a brigadier general in the regional command and was addressed through several intermediaries to the base personnel office at Fort Braddock. The final message in the chain was a single line added in response to a standard rotation request. It read, "Confirm coal transfer to Braddock. Harlan's request. Process immediately." Maya read it 3 times. Then she set it down on the desk beside her notebook. She had assumed her transfer was routine. Officers were rotated constantly based on need availability, the shifting logic of institutional assignments. She had accepted this posting because it was offered and because she was a soldier, and accepting posted assignments was what soldiers did. But Harlan had not simply tolerated her arrival. He had arranged it. She thought about this with the careful attention she had once applied to tactical maps in a forward operating base outside Mosul, looking for the detail that changed what everything else meant. If Harlan had requested her specifically, he wasn't caught off guard by her presence. He had anticipated it. She was not a problem that had arrived unexpectedly. She was a problem he had decided to handle on his own ground, in his own time, in the environment he controlled completely. She picked up the notebook. She wrote 1 word, "Why?" Then she underlined it. The answer came from Owens the following morning in pieces over the course of a 40-minute conversation that looked to anyone watching like a senior NCO briefing an incoming officer on logistics protocols. Maya's name had appeared on a preliminary list for a board review, captains being evaluated for early promotion to major. The list was internal, not widely circulated, but it had reached Harlan's desk through a contact in the personnel system. He had seen her file, seen the combat record and the commendations, the pattern of leadership under pressure that the Army's evaluation language tried to capture in boxes and bullet points, but never quite managed to contain. He had seen someone who would one day outrank him. Not immediately, not for years. But eventually, if her trajectory held, Maya Cole would be sitting in rooms where decisions were made about officers like Richard Harlan. She would be one of the people deciding whether his final years of service reflected the legacy he believed he had earned. He had decided to prevent that before it began. "How many before me?" Maya asked. Owens reached into his jacket again. A handwritten list on torn notebook paper, small careful letters. 6 names, each followed by a date. 6 female officers who had served under Harlan's command and rotated out of Fort Braddock between 2020 and 2024. Not one had filed a formal complaint. Not one had requested an investigation. They had simply quietly accepted reassignment and left. They all just left, Owen said. Maya looked at the list for a long moment. Then she took the paper from him, folded it carefully, and opened her notebook. She wrote all 6 names, first name, last name, year of departure. Then she turned to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote the date of the email. She wrote Harlan's name. She drew a single horizontal line across the page. Below the line, she began to write. The first 3 weeks at Fort Braddock were an education in a different kind of precision. Not the precision of military discipline. Maya had been raised on that. What she was learning here was the precision of a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of damage without fingerprints. Harlan never raised his voice at her directly. He never confronted her in a way that could be formally recorded. What he did instead was apply steady, systematic pressure at every point where her authority connected to the structure around her. During the first officer briefing of her second week, she presented a detailed analysis of an inconsistency in supply routing to the Southern Training Range. Her data was sound. Her conclusions were clear. She had spent 12 hours preparing it. Harlan let her speak for 90 seconds. Then he raised a hand without looking up from the table. "We'll stick with the standard process," he said. "I'm not interested in micromanagement from newer assignments. Newer assignments, not a junior officer, not even a name, a category, something with less weight than the furniture." The other officers in the room didn't look at her. That told her everything. 3 days later, the same routing adjustment she had recommended appeared in a revised logistics memo under Harlan's signature. She noted it in the notebook. Date content comparison to her original submission. She did not bring it up to anyone. At the end of her 3rd week, a note appeared under her door. She found it at 11:15 at night, returning from a late review session. Plain paper folded once, no identifying marks on the outside. She unfolded it, standing in the hallway in the light from the corridor. It said, "Check the transfer records 2018 to 2021. He did this before. You're not the first. Be careful." No signature. She stood there a moment in the yellow corridor light. She could hear the wind picking up outside, moving through the antenna cables on the roof of the adjacent building. From somewhere down the hall came the low sound of a television left on. She folded the note and went inside. She found the transfer records herself through the base administrative system over 4 evenings spent in her quarters after duty hours. The search took patience because she didn't know exactly what she was looking for, only that something was there buried in the ordinary paperwork of an institution that generated paper the way the desert generated dust. She found it on the 4th night. Lieutenant Marcus Hale, assigned to Fort Braddock in 2019 as an assistant operations officer. Promotion track, strong evaluations for the first 18 months. Then in the spring of 2020, a formal disciplinary note citing insubordination. Vague language, no specific incident named, no formal charges. Just a note, a demotion, a permanent redirection away from anything that would put him back near command-level decisions. She looked at the base maintenance log for the corresponding month. She scrolled through it, slowly looking for the kind of detail that administrative paperwork sometimes hid in the most ordinary places. She found a routine inspection report from March 2020. The signature at the bottom was tight and slightly compressed. The hand of someone who had learned to write quickly in the field. She had seen that handwriting before. She went back to the note, unfolded it on the desk beside the screen, put them side by side, the slope of the letters. The particular way the T was crossed with a line angling slightly upward. The small gap between words that suggested someone who thought faster than they wrote. Same hand. Marcus Hale had been a rising officer with a promotion track and an instinct for doing the right thing. He had watched Harlan threaten a junior female NC. Oh, the details were not in the file, but implied clearly enough in what was absent from it. He had done what his training told him to do. He had said something. And for that, he had been systematically removed from any position where he could do it again. He hadn't left Fort Braddock. He was still here carrying out maintenance inspections, watching the rotation of officers through the command structure, waiting for someone who might be able to use what he knew. 4 years. Maya closed both files. She sat back and looked at the ceiling of her quarters for a long moment. Then she picked up the notebook and wrote his name. Below it she wrote, "He stayed. He waited. He's been watching longer than any of us." She thought about what that costs a person. To remain in a place like this, reduced and deliberately invisible, holding information that no one had yet arrived who could use. To write a note and slip it under the door of a stranger and hope without any guarantee that this time would be different. She wrote one more line. She wrote, "He trusted me before he knew me. Don't make him wrong." Private Danica Webb was 19 years old and had arrived at Fort Braddock 6 weeks before Maya. She was from Detroit, the kind of city that shows up in Army recruitment numbers because it doesn't offer many other exits. She was not remarkable in the ways the Army measured remarkable. Not the fastest or the strongest or the one who caught the senior NCO's attention in the first week. What she was perceptive. Maya first noticed her on the third morning during formation. Just one soldier among many standing in the correct position, her uniform squared away, her eyes forward. But Maya noticed the moment when a staff sergeant from a different unit moved through the formation and said something low and dismissive near Webb's left ear. She noticed what Webb did with her face in response. She didn't react. She didn't flinch. She kept her eyes forward and her posture exactly where it was. But something moved through her expression for exactly 1 second, a contained, careful management of something that had clearly arrived there before. Maya recognized it. She had worn the same expression herself in different rooms at different ages. After formation, Maya fell in step beside the staff sergeant. "Sergeant," she said. He turned, looked at her rank, his posture adjusted. "That formation," she said, "the conduct needs to reflect the standard. You understand me?" He understood. She didn't mention it again. She didn't file anything. She made it clear in the language of authority that doesn't require volume that she had seen what happened and had chosen to address it. Later that week, Webb crossed Maya's path near the motor pool and came to attention with a salute slightly more precise than regulation required. Maya returned it and kept walking, but she noted it. The way you note things that tell you something true about the people around you. Danica Webb was 19 years old and already managing the weight of a system not designed to distribute that weight fairly. Doing it with composure and silence and a held endurance that nobody in this command was giving her credit for. Maya added her name to the notebook, not with a date or formal notation, just her name alone on a page near the back. She wasn't sure yet what it meant, only that it meant something. At the end of her fourth week, Maya requested a meeting with Harlan to discuss her unit's training schedule. A routine administrative meeting. She had prepared a 12-page document with supporting data. He gave her 11 minutes. For the first 8, he did not look up from a different document on his desk. His pen moved occasionally. None of it corresponded to what she was saying. In the 9th minute, he looked at her. "You know what the difference is," he said, "between a good officer and a great one." She waited. A great officer understands what the mission actually is. He set down his pen. "Your mission here isn't to redesign the training schedule. Your mission is to show your soldiers what it looks like to work within a command structure, to hold the line, not to redraw it." He picked his pen back up. "Dismissed." She gathered her 12 pages. She stood. She looked at him for one moment long enough to be a statement rather than a glance. Then she left. In the hallway, she walked to the end, turned the corner, and stopped. She leaned her back against the wall in the narrow corridor between the administrative wing and the maintenance offices. She stayed there for 30 seconds, breathing with controlled evenness, the document held against her chest. Then she pushed off the wall and kept walking. That night, she wrote 2 lines in the notebook, the date in one sentence that was not about the training schedule. She already knew about the training schedule. The sentence was about him. Then she closed it. That was enough for that night. She had spent her entire career hearing the same message in jokes and silences, and credit given to the person standing next to her for the work she had done. She knew this message. The difference now was that she was writing it down. Every date, every name, every word, every door that closed a little too firmly, every meeting cut too short, every report returned with red ink from a man who would reissue the same content under his own signature the following day. She was building something. She didn't know yet what it would become, but she knew the discipline required to build it. She had learned that discipline in a place where losing track of details cost not a professional setback. It cost your life or someone else's. She closed the notebook. She set it on the desk beside her water bottle and her field manual and the framed photo of her father in his dress blues taken in 1987, the year before she was born. "Is it worth it, Maya?" She hadn't answered him on the phone. She hadn't known the honest answer then. She was beginning to understand it now. Outside, the wind moved across Fort Braddock in long, dry waves, rattling the flagpole chain near the main gate, carrying the smell of a Texas plane that had been baked by the sun all day and was only now hours after dark beginning to release what it had been holding. And somewhere on the same base in a maintenance office that nobody paid particular attention to, a man named Marcus Hale was wondering whether the note he had slipped under a stranger's door had landed in the right hands. He had been wrong before. He had trusted the institution before. He knew what that belief had cost him. But he had written the note anyway, because some people, no matter how many times the system proves them wrong, cannot stop believing that the right person is still out there somewhere, still looking, still writing things down. The Army runs on paper. Anyone who has spent time inside it understands this. Every order, every decision, every transfer, every commendation, every reprimand exists in triplicate somewhere in a filing system that stretches back decades and never fully forgets anything. The institution's memory is longer than any individual career, longer sometimes than the people who built it intended. Richard Harlan understood this better than most. He had spent 30 years learning to move through the system's paper trails the way a careful man moves through a room in the dark, without touching the furniture, without making a sound that would carry. What he did to Maya Cole in the weeks following her arrival was not visible in any single document. It was distributed across dozens of them. Small adjustments, quiet redirections, the bureaucratic silence that descends when a request has been received and chosen not to be answered. Her unit's supply requisitions began arriving late, not dramatically, 3 days here, a week there. The kind of delay always attributable to processing backlogs to the slow grind of institutional machinery that no one person controls. But Maya tracked the dates. She compared them against requisition logs from adjacent units. The delays were specific. They were hers alone. 2 training simulations scheduled for her unit were canceled inside of 10 days. The first came with a brief administrative notice, citing scheduling conflicts on the range. The second came with nothing she learned about it when her soldiers showed up at 0600 for a drill that the range officer told them had been pulled from the calendar the previous afternoon. She filed a formal inquiry. It was acknowledged. Nothing followed. What followed instead was something more difficult to document and therefore more damaging. Harlan began speaking directly to her soldiers, not about anything formally constituting interference with her command authority. He would stop a sergeant in the motor pool and ask about maintenance schedules. He would walk through a barracks inspection that fell within her unit's area and address junior enlisted directly with the casual authority of a senior officer who sees no boundaries because he has never been given reason to recognize them. The message was clear to everyone who received it. Your captain answers to me, and I am not convinced she is worth answering to. Her soldiers were not stupid. They were young, most of them, and lacked the accumulated experience to fully name what they were watching. But they could feel the weight of it. Maya saw it in the slight hesitation before a salute, the lowered eyes during morning formation, the conversations that stopped a beat too late when she entered a room. She said nothing to anyone. She wrote it in the notebook. She kept doing her job. The physical stress test came on a Thursday morning, 11 days into her second month. No advance notice. The timing was 10:55, nearly 11 in the morning, the sun already committed over the Texas plain. Full kit, full weight, no modifications for heat index. The order came through the general duty roster attributed to command authority, no specific name attached. Maya received it the same way her soldiers did, with 40 minutes notice. She understood immediately what it was. The design test constructed not to measure performance, but to produce failure. To create a public record of a unit struggling. To give a commander something he could point to in a formal evaluation and say with complete technical accuracy that these soldiers underperformed. She went to her locker. She put on her kit. She laced her boots with the care of someone who intends to stay on their feet for a long time. Then she walked out to the formation area and took her position not in front of her unit, not behind it, but beside it, in the line. In the same sun, carrying the same weight. Private Danica Webb was 3 positions to her left. She looked once at Maya, then looked forward. A young soldier near the front of the formation said quietly without turning his head, "You don't have to run with us, ma'am." Maya kept her eyes forward. "You're not running without me." The course was 4 miles. Sand stretches, concrete straightaways, a sandbag, carry across a 100-meter obstacle field, a wall climb at the 3-mile mark. In full gear, in 11 o'clock Texas sun, they ran it, every one of them, and they ran it together, which is different from simply running it. Maya set a pace in the first mile that was demanding but sustainable. When a younger soldier began to fade at the 2-mile mark, she moved alongside him, not speaking, just present, just there. And something about her presence recalibrated something in him, and he held the pace. They came across the finish line first, as a unit, intact. From the observation tower above the east side of the field, Richard Harlan watched. He had a clipboard in his hands, By the time they crossed the line, the clipboard was gripped so tightly that the aluminum edge had left a faint mark on his palm. His face showed nothing that could be formally named. But Dex Owens, positioned near the base of the tower and watching everything carefully, said later that he had never seen a man work so hard to look unaffected by something. 3 evenings after the stress test at 1900 hours, Maya was alone in the operations room reviewing a logistics map when the door opened. She knew before she turned who it was. She recognized it in the quality of silence that preceded the sound of the latch, the silence of a man who has arrived with a specific intention and has already calculated the variables. Harlan closed the door behind him. The operations room was not large. A table in the center, maps spread across it, standing lamps on the far wall, throwing long shadows across the floor. Maya stood at the near end of the table. There was one door. He was in front of it. "Captain," he said. She finished the notation she was making on the map's margin, set her pen down, and turned. "Sir." He moved into the room, not toward the table, toward her. The movement communicated everything it was intended to communicate. This was not a superior officer entering a workspace to discuss operations. This was a man using physical space the way he used institutional authority, as a demonstration, as a reminder of the basic geometry of power. "You've got a habit," he said, his voice low, "of making the men uncomfortable." She said nothing. "You think discipline makes you respected." He took another step, close enough that she could smell the coffee on the starch of his uniform. "It just makes you difficult." "With respect, sir," she said, her voice flat and even as a desert highway, "I'm here to lead soldiers, not to make them comfortable." His eyes moved over her face, calculating, looking for the tell, the slight tremor in the jaw, the swallow, the microscopic shift in posture that would signal he had found the edge of her composure. He had found that edge in others in this room. He had watched people take a half step back. She did not take a half step back. "You're bold," he said. And then, because he had learned nothing in 30 years that this institution had not actively reinforced, he added, "bold for a woman." The words arrived in the air between them and stayed there. She felt them land. She would not pretend otherwise, not even to herself. She felt them the way you feel a low temperature stepping outside, not as a surprise exactly, but as confirmation of something you already knew was waiting. She had spent her entire career being told in this and 100 less direct formulations that boldness in her was a kind of excess, a violation of some implicit standard that everyone understood and no one was willing to write down. She looked at him steadily. "I'll take that as a compliment," she said. He moved closer. One more step, close enough that the distance between them was no longer professional. A boundary crossed, deliberately calculated to provoke either a retreat or a response he could use. She stayed exactly where she was. "Permission to leave, sir," she said. The silence that followed lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. She watched it move across his face, the micro-adjustment of a man who has deployed a particular weapon and found for the first time in a long time that it has not produced the expected result. His jaw tightened. Something behind his eyes recalculated. He stepped back. She walked to the door. She opened it, stepped through, and closed it behind her with exactly the right amount of force. Not a slam, not a controlled click, just a door closing. Outside, the night air hit her face. She walked 20 meters from the building, stopped, and stood there for a moment in the dark, looking up at a sky that had gone completely clear, the stars sharp and indifferent above Fort Braddock, Texas. Her hands were not shaking. She checked because she wanted to know. They were not shaking. She walked back to her quarters and wrote everything down. 2 days later, a file arrived on her workstation through the base's internal secure message system. No sender identification. No subject line. Inside was a single document, 12 pages scanned from physical copies, with edges slightly uneven in the way of papers folded and unfolded many times. She read it carefully. Colonel Vance Pryor had been assigned as official investigating officer for what the Army was now calling an informal review of command climate at Fort Braddock, the preliminary review that either produces a recommendation for escalation or produces a memorandum that uses the word comprehensive 4 times and concludes with no actionable findings. Pryor's record showed 23 years of service, steady promotion, track, no combat deployments, background in administrative law and command evaluation. On paper, exactly the kind of officer suited for this kind of work. On page 7, she found a letter dated 2015. A formal promotion recommendation, the kind that officers write for other officers at specific career junctures. Detailed, professional, specific about the candidate's qualities and suitability for increased responsibility. It had been written by Richard Harlan. For Vance Pryor, she sat back. She turned to page 9, a summary of preliminary outreach to potential witnesses. 4 names. Next to 2 of them, the status notation was identical, withdrawn no further comment. Both had been contacted. Both had decided not to speak. She turned to the last page. A single paragraph administrative note describing what sounded like standard procedure and very little like what it actually was. The preliminary review had been leaking. Specific details, names of potential witnesses, scope of inquiry, interview timelines had been reaching the legal advisor attached to Harlan's office before they should have been available to anyone outside the review team. The man responsible for determining whether an investigation was warranted was operating from a professional foundation built at least in part on the goodwill of the man at the center of the inquiry. The system was not simply broken. Someone was actively feeding information from inside the review to the people the review was supposed to be examining. Maya closed the file. She wrote Pryor's name in the notebook. She wrote the date of the promotion letter. She drew a line connecting his name to Harlan's. Then she sat back and looked at what she had drawn and thought about how long this invisible architecture of mutual protection had been in place and how perfectly ordinary it looked from the outside. She wrote one more note. She underlined it. The investigation is not safe. 6 days passed. On the morning of the 7th day, she found Marcus Hale in person for the first time. She had not gone looking for him. She had gone to the maintenance bay to follow up on a delayed equipment request, the third such delay in 2 weeks, and he was there at a workbench in the back of the long room, doing something careful and unhurried with a circuit board. He did not look up when she entered. He looked up when she stopped at the entrance to a section and stood there without speaking. He was younger than she had expected. Early 30s with the careful stillnesses of someone who has spent several years making himself easy to overlook. His rank indicated specialist, which was not what his original service record said he should be carrying by now. She did not introduce herself. She said only the note. He set down the circuit board. He looked at her directly for the first time. I was in the building, he said. July 2019. I was on a late operations duty shift, the kind nobody asked for. Harlan didn't know I was still there. He paused. I heard it through a door that wasn't fully latched. I had my phone in my pocket. I had enough presence of mind to record it before I fully understood what I was hearing. He looked at his hands. I've been holding it for 4 years, waiting for someone who could actually use it. She said nothing. I sent it through the internal system, he said, because I needed it on record somewhere official, even without a name attached. If something happened to me, it would exist. She looked at him for a long moment. Why didn't you go to the IG office? I watched what happened to the 2 people who did, he said, in 2018 and 2019. I watched where those complaints went. He met her eyes. I decided the document needed to wait for the right person, not the right office. She held his gaze. He held hers. The file is on the system, she said. I need a signed statement from you about how it was obtained. Date, time, location, method, signed and dated, kept in your own possession and submitted through the chain. I know, he said. I've had the statement written for 3 years. She nodded once. She turned to leave. Captain, he said. She stopped. I was starting to think I'd gotten it wrong, he said quietly, thinking the right person wasn't coming. She did not turn around. Write it up today, she said. Submit it by 1700. She walked back out into the Texas sun. She listened to the recording that same evening. The audio was poor quality, the kind that comes from a phone placed in a jacket pocket in a room under circumstances where audio quality was not the primary concern. Background noise, a distant phone, the sound of a chair, multiple voices, indistinct, then 2 that were closer, clearer. She recognized Harlan's voice immediately. The date of the recording was July 2019. A voice she did not recognize said, Novak's been checked in to the depot in Georgia. She's stable. Her family's been notified that she requested the transfer. A pause, then Harlan's voice. And the medical situation, the other voice choosing words with precision. The circumstances are being managed. There won't be paperwork that creates a problem. The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. Then Harlan said, handle it quietly. That was all. The voices moved away from the device. The recording continued for another 40 seconds of background noise, and then ended. Maya sat with the file closed on her screen. She had known since the night she found Elise Novak's record that the absence of an investigation was not an accident. Absences of that particular kind in an institution that documents everything do not occur by accident. They require intention. The specific decision of a person with the authority to ensure a question is not asked, or if asked, not answered. But knowing and hearing are different things. Hearing it in his own voice, unhurried, certain, using the exact language of a man who has done this kind of managing before and sees no reason to speak carefully, because in the room where he was speaking, there was no one who would hold him to account. Handle it quietly. She looked at the notebook on the desk. She opened it to a blank page near the middle, not in the column of dates and evidence, on its own page, the way you give a person space rather than filing them. She wrote Elise Novak. She sat with the name for a long moment. Then she did something she had not done since arriving at Fort Braddock. She closed her workstation. She stood up. She crossed the room and pushed the door closed. She sat down on the edge of her bunk, not at the desk, not in the posture of a soldier processing information, just on the edge, hands between her knees, looking at the floor. She thought about what it costs a person to ask for help inside a system carefully arranged to make asking for help feel like a threat to your career. She thought about the weight of that calculation made alone, probably at night, probably in a room not much different from this one. She thought about what it means to make the only decision that feels survivable and then discover that survival was not the outcome. She did not write any of this down. Some things are not for the record. She sat there for a long time. Then she opened her workstation. She pulled up the form for a voluntary reassignment request. She read through it once. Then she began to fill it out, methodically. Name, rank, unit designation, standard language for personal welfare considerations. She filled it out to the last line. She sat with her hand over the submit function. She thought about Elise Novak's expression in the enlistment photo, the way she was looking at something past the frame. She thought about Marcus Hale in a maintenance bay, carrying a 4-year-old, recording, still believing someone would come. She thought about 6 names written in a notebook. Women who had come here and encountered something they were not equipped to fight alone and made the only decision that felt available and left. She did not judge them. She understood it completely. But she had seen where that path led in the silence of a follow-on record, in a 2-line administrative notation that was all that remained of a 27-year-old woman from Ohio. She removed her hand from the keyboard. She sat another long moment. Then she closed the form without submitting it. She closed the workstation. She lay down on her bunk with her boots still on and stared at the ceiling in the dark until sleep finally arrived, slowly, reluctantly, like a soldier ordered somewhere they don't want to go. In the morning, she deleted the form. She opened the notebook to a fresh page. She wrote the date and continued. What happened next did not come from a tip or a file. It came from Maya herself, from the discipline of a person who has learned to look at the thing everyone else has agreed not to look at. She had been working through base medical administrative records, accessible through her clearance level, not full clinical files, but intake and exit records documenting which personnel had sought medical services during their posting and how those visits had been processed. She was looking for a pattern, elevated stress indicators, repeated visits corresponding to specific events or timeframes. The kind of data that, assembled carefully, tells a story that no individual data point is authorized to tell. She found the pattern. And then she found something else. Sergeant Elise Novak. The entry was brief, standard administrative notation. Novak had been assigned to Fort Braddock beginning January 2019. Her posting ended abruptly in July of the same year, 7 months into what should have been an 18-month rotation. The exit notation cited a voluntary reassignment request approved through command authority. Harlan's name appeared in the approval line. Maya pulled the reassignment documentation. 2 pages. Generic language. No explanation for the request, unusual, since voluntary reassignment requests almost always included at least a brief statement of purpose for scheduling and resource planning reasons. This one had nothing. She went back to the base records and searched for Novak's name in the follow-on system, the administrative tracking that followed personnel after reassignment. The follow-on record was very short. Sergeant Elise Novak had departed Fort Braddock on July 14, 2019. She had been assigned to a processing depot in Georgia pending her next permanent posting. She had checked into that depot on July 18th. She had been found dead on August 6, 2019. 23 days after leaving Fort Braddock. The official record listed the cause as a personal incident, non-combat, not service-connected. No investigation noted. No follow-up inquiry. No documentation of any review of the circumstances surrounding her departure or her death 3 weeks later. No one had asked any questions, or if they had, the answers had gone somewhere this record system could not reach. Now sitting with the audio recording fresh in her memory, handle it quietly. Maya understood the absence was not bureaucratic negligence. It was the result. She opened the notebook to the page where she had written Elise Novak's name. She sat with it for a long time. Then she picked up her pen and wrote what she would have said if she could have said anything, if the timing of things had been different and she had been standing in the right place at the right moment. She wrote it in full, every word. She did not date it. She did not address it to anyone. When she was done, she closed the notebook and sat in the quiet of her room and let the stillness settle around her, the way it settles around a person who has just arrived at a decision they cannot walk back from. She was not going to leave. Not because she wasn't afraid. She was. She understood exactly what Harlan was capable of. She now had from a recording she had not asked for evidence that his capacity for harm extended far beyond the administrative manipulation she had been tracking. But fear was not the question. The question was whether, in full knowledge of what she was afraid of, she could live with the alternative. She opened the notebook to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote one line. She wrote, "What happens next is going to cost something. Pay it." She underlined it once. Then she set the pen down, picked up her water bottle, and drank. Outside, Fort Braddock was moving into its midday rhythm. The sun was at full height over the Texas plain. The training fields were active. Somewhere on the far side of the base, in a maintenance bay that nobody paid attention to, a man named Marcus Hale was waiting for a sign that he had not, after 4 years, been wrong to trust. He had not been wrong. It would take time for him to know that. But the decision had been made. In a room with the door closed and a notebook on the desk by a woman who had been afraid and had checked her hands and found them steady and decided that steady was enough. The base had a different sound to it now. Maya noticed it first in the mornings during the window between reveille and the first formation, when Fort Braddock was technically in motion, but hadn't yet organized itself into the full machinery of the duty day. The conversations that had once been careless in their volume had become measured. Eye contact that had once been performed for the benefit of whoever was watching had become something more considered. Fort Braddock was deciding what it believed, not in any formal or organized way. It was happening in the space between things, in the pause before a salute, and the quality of the salute itself, in the way certain soldiers straightened when Maya walked past, and certain others found reasons to be looking elsewhere. In the mess hall at midday, in the maintenance bays, in the larney rooms and briefing rooms, and the long corridor between the administrative wing and the operations center, the institution was making up its mind. And institutions, when they do this, tend to do it slowly and then all at once. Owens told her that the count of people who had quietly indicated willingness to give a formal statement had reached 11. He told her this not to encourage her, but because he was a man who had learned to account for the distance between what people intend and what they do. He had seen willingness evaporate when the formal moment arrived. In other commands in other years before Fort Braddock, she noted it. She kept working. Private Danica Webb found her on a Tuesday evening near the equipment storage behind the Eastern Barracks. Maya was conducting a routine inventory, clipboard in hand, working through the list with the focused attention of someone who uses practical tasks to stay grounded when larger things are moving in directions she cannot fully control. Webb approached and came to attention with the precise formality she always used. "At ease," Maya said without looking up. Webb relaxed into parade rest. She stood there for a moment in the way of someone who has been composing a sentence for longer than the sentence warrants. "We see what's happening, ma'am," she finally said. Maya made a notation on the clipboard. "We talk," Webb said. "In the barracks, after lights out mostly. Not all of us, but enough." She paused. "We're not going anywhere." Maya looked up from the clipboard. She looked at this 19-year-old from Detroit who had arrived at Fort Braddock with nothing guaranteed and had been finding ways to hold her composure under a weight that was not equally distributed across this command, who had been managing it quietly and without recognition for months before Maya ever arrived. "You don't owe me anything," Maya said. "No, ma'am," Webb said. "It's not about owing." Maya held her gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the clipboard. "Dismissed," she said. Webb saluted and left. Maya stood in the storage area with the clipboard in her hands and the inventory half finished around her, and allowed herself for exactly 3 measured breaths to feel the weight of being seen by the people who had most reason to look away. Then she finished the inventory. The day of the confrontation began like any other. 0600 formation, duty assignments distributed. The Texas morning still cool enough to be bearable, the sun not yet at the angle that turned everything oppressive. Maya had briefed her unit on the morning's schedule, a live field maneuver, standard parameters, her soldiers positioned and ready. She had not expected Harlan to be on the field. He was there when the maneuver began, positioned off to the eastern side of the drill yard with two staff officers and a tactical observer. He was not there to oversee. He was there because he had decided in whatever calculus he was running that the time for subtlety had passed. The maneuver was 12 minutes old when Maya identified a vulnerability in the left flank coverage. Not a dramatic problem, a standard gap in positioning that opens when the third element moves to support the center, the kind caught and corrected in training precisely because it needs to be caught before it matters in the field. She issued the command to reposition, clear, concise, within every parameter of her authority. Harlan's voice came across the field like a door being kicked open. Captain Cole, loud enough that the entire formation heard it, loud enough that it was not a correction. It was a summons. Who authorized that repositioning? Her voice remained steady. Per field protocol, sir, I observed a vulnerability in the left flank and took initiative to. That is not your call to make. He was moving now, coming across the field in the purposeful stride of a man who has decided the performance matters more than the outcome. The formation had stopped being a formation and become an audience. Maya felt the shift, the specific stillness that descends when something is happening that everyone understands is not about what it appears to be about. She held her ground. Sir, I acted in accordance with standard field. Don't lecture me on standards. He was close now. The distance between them no longer professional. I wrote the standards for this field. He stepped into her space. The movement of a man who has spent 30 years using proximity as a weapon and has never once been made to reconsider the practice. His face was close to hers. Not rage, not entirely. Calculation. The assessment of a man who has chosen this moment deliberately and is now executing what he came here to execute. His right arm moved. Not fast. Not the instinctive motion of someone who has lost control. It moved with the specific, deliberate quality of someone who has decided that the gesture is worth making. His hand came up and forward, aimed at her face, the flat palm motion of a man who intends to leave a mark on every level a mark can be left. He never made it. The second his shoulder committed forward, her training fired 11 years of close quarters defense, compressed into a single explosive second. Her left hand came up. She caught his wrist midair. The pivot came from her hips, driving upward through her core, using the leverage of his own momentum against him with the efficiency of a technique performed 10,000 times. She stepped through her weight, shifting her grip controlled, and his arm went where physics and 11 years of training said it had to go. The sound was clean and final. He went to one knee. The sound that came from him was involuntary. His face went the color of old concrete. His right arm hung at an angle. Arms are not designed to hold. The formation did not move. Maya released her grip immediately. She straightened. Her breathing was controlled. She looked down at him for exactly one moment, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, but with the flat, clear expression of a person who has just done what the situation required and is already thinking about what comes next. "You will never raise your hand to me again," she said. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. From somewhere in the back of the formation, a sound moved through the ranks. Not a cheer. The sound of an exhale held too long, finally released. The sound of people breathing again at the same time. A medic sprinted from the perimeter. Owens appeared from the direction of the observation tower, moving with the controlled urgency of a man who has been watching and waiting and is now in motion. Maya turned to the formation. "Back to attention," she said. They obeyed, not because of rank, because something greater than rank had just been demonstrated in the dirt in front of them. She was sitting alone in the administrative room they assigned her 3 hours later when Aaron Tate knocked on the door. She did not know his name yet. He was young, early 20s, the face of someone not yet fully shaped by the places the Army sends people. A specialist assigned to base technical services. He had a hard drive in his hand about the size of a paperback book. He held it out to her without preamble. "I made a copy," he said, "the night it happened, before the maintenance order came through." She looked at the drive, then at him. "What maintenance order?" "One came through around 2200, he said. "Routine system format. That's what it was called. I was the duty tech." He was steady, but she could see the effort it cost him. The cameras on the East drill yard were included in the format list. All 5 of them. She understood immediately what she was hearing. "I'd already backed up the footage before I ran the format," he said. "I don't know exactly why I did it. I just—" He stopped. It didn't feel like maintenance. She looked at the drive in his hand. 5 camera angles from the East drill yard. The complete unedited record of what had happened on that field that morning. Footage that someone with authority over base technical systems had decided within hours of the incident needed to not exist in its original form. Do you understand what you're telling me? She said. Yes, ma'am. And you're telling me anyway. He was quiet for a moment. Then someone had to. She took the drive. She set it on the desk beside the black notebook. She looked at the two objects side by side. You need to put in writing. She said exactly what happened tonight. The maintenance order, the timing, what you did and why. You date it, you sign it, you give me a copy, and you keep a copy. Yes, ma'am. And Tate, she said. He looked at her. What you did required something, she said. I want you to know I understand that. He nodded once, then he left. She sat alone in the administrative room with the hard drive and the notebook and the silence of a place where large things have recently been decided. Through the window, the base continued its business. Lights in the barracks. The low headlights of a vehicle moving along the perimeter road. The flagpole at the main gate, the flag moving in a wind she could see but not hear through the glass. She opened the notebook. She wrote the date. She wrote Aaron Tate's name and what he had told her. Then she wrote the phrase, maintenance order, and underlined it 3 times. She wrote, they tried to erase the record. The record survives. The formal suspension order arrived the following morning. Administrative reassignment pending inquiry, signed by General Lorna Weston through the regional command. The language was precise and neutral in the way that military language becomes when it is trying to occupy 2 positions simultaneously. Brigadier General Frank Mercer arrived that afternoon on a transport from the Pentagon. Owens described him in 4 words. He closes things down. A man of measured silences and polished boots, in the expression of someone who has spent a career arriving at difficult situations and departing them before they became headlines. He called a closed meeting with General Weston and the legal team. Maya was not in the room. She did not need to be. She had been in enough institutions to know what was being said. Contain, control. Keep the name of this base out of the conversation that was already beginning to happen in the places where military oversight conversations happened. What they had not accounted for was the dam. It broke on the 3rd day, not in any single dramatic moment. The way things break that have been holding too long in multiple places at different times with different faces and different voices, each one separate and then suddenly in aggregate something that could not be managed quietly. The first formal statement came from a lieutenant in the motor pool who had served under Harlan 3 years earlier. He gave his statement in 45 minutes and said at the end of it that he had been waiting to say it in an official capacity since the month had happened. By the end of the first week, 11 formal statements. By the end of the second, 23. By the time the regional command accepted the recommendation to escalate to a formal Article 32, hearing the number had passed 30 and it was still moving. Not all of them were about the same kind of incident. Some were about career sabotage, some about verbal abuse, some about the professional violence of being systematically removed from opportunity because you had at some point declined to behave in the way Harlan's command required. They were different in their specifics. They were identical in their shape. A senator on the Armed Services Committee made a public statement requesting a briefing. 2 veterans advocacy organizations released statements within 48 hours of each other, both citing the same pattern, both naming the same institution. A former staff sergeant who had left the Army in 2021 gave an interview to a military affairs publication, careful factual describing in the unadorned language of someone who has had years to organize what they need to say, the specific experience of reporting a concern through proper channels and watching it disappear. Fort Braddock was no longer an internal matter, and Vance Pryor's role in making it internal had not escaped the inquiry. On the 11th day, he submitted his resignation from the investigating officer role. The formal explanation cited scheduling conflicts. Nobody in the room where the decision was processed used the words conflict of interest out loud. But the promotion recommendation letter signed by Harlan in 2015 had been entered into the record by then, and the 2 junior officers who had received informal outreach before their witness interviews had both submitted formal accounts of that contact within 72 hours of each other. Pryor's resignation was accepted. A separate inquiry into his conduct as investigating officer was opened by the Inspector General's office the same week. Maya noted it in the notebook. She drew a line from his name to Harlan's, the same line she had drawn weeks earlier, and next to it she wrote account opened. It was not resolution. She understood the difference. But it was the record beginning to correct itself, which was in the architecture of institutions the necessary first step before anything else could happen. Maya was transferred to Westfield Command Center in Virginia 12 days after the incident on the drill field. The transfer order called it a temporary rotational assignment. The promotion attached to it called her Major Cole for the first time. She understood both the substance and the mechanics of what was happening. They were moving her out of the immediate theater. They were dressing the movement in the language of advancement. It was containment wearing the uniform of reward. She packed her quarters in 2 hours. The notebook went into the inner pocket of her kit bag, where it had always traveled. The photo of her father in his dress blues went in after it. Owens was waiting outside the building when she emerged. 11 years here, he said. Watched a lot of people leave. She adjusted the strap on her bag. You're the first one, he said, that I watched the rest of the base watch leave. She looked at him. That's not nothing, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Keep writing things down, Dex. Already doing it, Major. She walked to the transport. The Article 32 hearing was held at Fort Myer, Washington. The room had oak paneling and high windows, and the weight that comes from being the site of decisions that outlast the people who make them. A 3-officer panel sat at the head of the room. Sketch artists worked at small tables along the side wall. The gallery held attorneys, investigators, military observers, and a contained but unmistakable civilian presence. Staffers, advocates, 2 people with the posture of congressional staff who were there to watch and report. Harlan sat at the defense table in his dress uniform, his right arm held with a deliberate stillness that suggested it had not fully recovered. His chest carried the accumulated medals of a 30-year career. He looked at the room with the expression of a man who had occupied positions of authority so long that he still expected rooms to organize themselves around him by default. This room did not do this. Maya took her oath in a clear voice and sat down and looked at the panel and told them the truth. Not the compressed, selective version that formal proceedings sometimes encourage, the complete version. She started not with the incident on the drill field, but with the email that Owens had put in her hand. In her second week, Harlan's name in the request line, the deliberate targeting of an officer whose promotion trajectory he intended to intercept. She moved through 7 weeks of documentation with the precision of someone who had written every date and every word in a notebook that she had carried across 2 states and was now upon formal requests submitted as evidentiary record. She talked about the 6 women on the list. She gave their names, she noted the years they had left in the absence of any complaint in the formal record, and what that absence meant in a system that required courage to navigate even in the best conditions. And these had not been the best conditions. She talked about Elise Novak. She said the name clearly, and then she said what she had found in the administrative record, and then she described the audio file, its origin, its chain of custody, the signed statement from Marcus Hale that had been submitted into evidence along with the file itself. The internal system timestamp, placing the upload 4 years and 7 months before this hearing room. She described what Hale had told her in the maintenance bay, how he had obtained it, why he had held it as long as he had. She described the specific words on the recording with the precision of someone who has listened to them many times and is not going to allow imprecision to provide anyone with a reason to question what was said. The panel had already reviewed the file. She knew this. She was not telling them what was on it. She was telling them and everyone else in the room the complete human story of how it had survived long enough to be heard. The story of a young officer in a jacket pocket and a phone in his hand, in a door that wasn't fully latched, who had held what he heard for 4 years because he had nowhere to take it that was safe. She paused for a moment after she said this. Then she added, Colonel Harlan didn't just create this environment. He maintained it, actively. Every time someone found the courage to name what was happening, the system he had built around himself made that naming cost more than most people could afford to pay. She looked at the panel. Sergeant Elise Novak paid that cost. I want her name in this record, not as a file number, as a person. The room was very still when she finished. When the floor went to Harlan's defense counsel, the argument was constructed from available materials. Maya had acted outside protocol. Her psychological state was a factor, the stress of a combat background, the pressure of a command environment, a pattern of difficulty integrating within the chain. She had applied physical force to a superior officer, and this was a matter of military law that did not admit of emotional framing. It was a reasonable argument, the kind that functions as formal structure for the record. Harlan requested the opportunity to make a final statement. The panel granted it. He stood. He had the bearing of a man who has spent 30 years being the person rooms deferred to, and some part of that bearing persisted as reflex even now. He looked at the panel. He spoke about the nature of command authority, about the history of this institution, about the qualities required of officers who served at the level he had served. He spoke for 4 minutes. In the 4th minute, with an instinct toward emphasis, he lowered his voice to address the panel with the intimate directness of someone appealing to a shared understanding. He was not aware, or perhaps had simply decided that the positioning of the microphone had not changed. She should have known her place, he said. The words were quiet. The room was very quiet. The microphone was not quiet. The panel heard it. The gallery heard it. The sketch artist heard it. The staffers from the congressional offices heard it. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke for a moment that lasted several seconds and contained in its silence the complete collapse of the argument that 30 minutes of legal preparation had just constructed. Harlan seemed to understand in the expression that crossed his face in the seconds that followed that he had just provided the panel with something that no testimony or documentation could have provided as effectively. Not evidence of what he had done, evidence of what he still believed. Evidence that 30 years had not changed the fundamental orientation from which every decision had flowed. He had ended himself, not with violence, with the exact to-do, the exact thinking that had made him dangerous from the beginning. He sat down. The panel exchanged a look that was not long, but was sufficient. The deliberation lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. Maya sat in an anteroom with Major Claire Ashton, who had come from Westfield with a file folder she hadn't opened and a coffee she hadn't touched. They did not talk much. They had said what needed to be said in the previous weeks in the long days at Westfield, where Maya had reviewed files and drafted policy recommendations and tried to do the next thing in a sequence that felt for much of that time like it was leading somewhere she couldn't see. The door opened. An aide stepped in with the formal notification. She read it. Unanimous finding. Richard Harlan was guilty on all counts: conduct unbecoming of an officer, abuse of command authority, systematic suppression of formal complaints. Stripped of rank, separated from service under dishonorable discharge. The case record, including the audio file and all supporting documentation related to Sergeant Elise Novak, formally referred to the Department of Justice for civil investigation. Maya set the notification down on the table in front of her. She did not cheer. She did not cry. She sat still for a moment with her eyes closed and let herself breathe fully for the first time since a Tuesday morning in Texas when she had stood on a drill field and made a decision she had known in the moment of making it she could not take back. Then she opened her eyes. The Novak referral, she said to Ashton. I want to see how that moves. I'll flag it, Ashton said. Every step. Every step, Ashton confirmed. Maya nodded. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. She put it on. The last witness had been the seventh. His arrival in that hearing room was in its own way the most important thing that happened in those 5 days of proceedings. His name was Roy Ackerman. He was 61 years old, retired, and he walked into the hearing room with a cane he had needed since a training injury in 2016 improperly managed, leaving a permanent limitation in his right knee. He had been a sergeant major, one of the most senior enlisted grades in the Army, a rank that takes 20 or more years to reach, and requires, in addition to technical competence, the kind of character that the institution reserves its highest enlisted trust for. He had been pushed into early retirement in the spring of 2018. A junior soldier under his supervision had been subjected to an encounter with Harlan that Ackerman had witnessed and responded to by filing a formal objection through the chain of command. The process that followed had been patient and precise and entirely focused on creating a documentation trail that would support Ackerman's separation rather than Harlan's accountability. He had been gone 6 years. He had watched from civilian life as Harlan continued to operate, and the system continued to permit it. He had made calls. He had written letters. He had received the particular silence that institutions deploy when they have decided that a former employee's concerns are not within the current scope of their attention. Owens had found him. 2 weeks of tracking through a network of veterans contacts built over 15 years, and finally a phone number through a mutual acquaintance at a post in Georgia. He had called Ackerman on a Thursday night and spoken to him for an hour, and at the end of the hour, Ackerman had said that he would come. He sat down in the witness chair with his cane resting against his knee. He looked at the panel with the expression of a man who has had 6 years to decide exactly what he wants to say and is not going to waste the opportunity by being imprecise about it. I have waited 6 years to sit in this chair, he said. He was not angry when he said it. He was not performing. He said it the way you state a fact about time, with the calm of someone for whom the wait has been real, and the fact of its ending is simply that, real. He spoke for 31 minutes. He did not use notes. He described what he had witnessed in 2018, what he had done in response, and what had happened to him as a result, with a specificity of detail that came from 6 years of being certain he had done the right thing and being unable to find a room where that right thing could be formally received. The panel did not interrupt him once. When he was finished, the room held its silence for a moment. Then the presiding officer thanked him and he stood collected his cane and walked out of the hearing room with the measured dignity of a man who has discharged an obligation that was a long time coming. The return to Fort Braddock happened on a Friday morning 3 weeks after the verdict. General Weston met her at the gate. She walked with Maya across the main parade ground toward the assembly area. The general said nothing for most of the walk. Then a few meters from the formation area, she stopped. "You were right," she said. Maya waited. "About what happens when one soldier stands up." Weston looked at the formation area where the sound of personnel assembling was beginning to rise. "Turns out others follow." The formation was nearly 300 soldiers, not assembled for a standard duty inspection, standing in the way that people stand when they have been given a reason to be somewhere that matters to them. Owens was in the front rank on the right flank, his posture carrying its characteristic composure. Danica Webb was 3 rows back, her eyes forward, her uniform as precise as it had been on every morning since the first formation Maya had seen her in. The ceremony was not long. Military recognition rarely is. The Army's formal language for these moments is economical because the substance of what is being recognized is already understood by everyone present, and adding words to it risks making it smaller rather than larger. General Weston read the citation, signed by the Secretary of the Army. It spoke of moral courage, physical discipline, and service to the principles of justice and accountability within the institution. It acknowledged the specific conditions under which these qualities had been demonstrated and declined in the precise way of official language to minimize what those conditions had required. She pinned the oak leaf cluster to Maya's collar. Major Cole. The sound that came from the formation was not a cheer exactly. It was the sound of people who have been carrying something for a long time and have been given in this moment permission to set it down. The sound of relief organized into expression. Webb was the only one Maya saw cry. She was not the only one who did. Owen saluted with the crisp precision of 15 years of service and genuine feeling behind every degree of the angle. Maya returned it and held it a moment longer than regulation required. That night in her new quarters at Fort Braddock, she sat at the desk with the black notebook in front of her. It was full. Every page. She turned it from the front slowly, not reading, just moving through the weight of it. The dates, the names, the timelines, the 6 names Owens had given her, the single name on the page near the middle that had no date beside it, no evidentiary notation, just space. The lines of analysis and the lines that were not analysis at all, that were something else, something she had not had a formal category for and had written anyway. She turned to the last page. She looked at the final notation. Then she turned past it to the inside back cover, and in the small margin at the bottom of the page, she wrote 2 words. Never again. She closed the notebook. She set it to one side. On the desk beside it, Major Ashton had placed a folder before Maya had left for the ceremony. Inside was a preliminary assessment of 5 installations identified through the cross-reference of complaint suppression patterns, irregular transfer rates, and the specific administrative fingerprints that the Fort Braddock Review had taught them to recognize. 5 bases, different states, different commands, different names at the top of the organizational chart. The same shape. Maya opened the folder. She read through the preliminary page. Then she set it to one side and picked up a new notebook from the stack Ashton had also left, black cover, spiral bound, completely empty, and placed it in the center of the desk. She looked at it. She thought about what the next thing would cost. She knew now with the precision of experience exactly what the accounting looked like. She had paid it once in full. She understood the payment would be required again, in different forms at different times, and that understanding this in advance did not make the cost smaller. It just meant she could plan for it. She opened the new notebook to the first page. She wrote Elise Novak's name at the top. Not as a case reference, not as an evidentiary entry, just the name alone with space around it. Below it, she wrote the 5 base names from Ashton's folder, each one on its own line, each one carrying whatever it carried, the weight of patterns she had not yet documented, the specific shape of a harm she had not yet mapped, the faces of people she had not yet met, who were at this moment doing what she had done in her first weeks at Fort Braddock. Managing the weight of it, writing nothing down, waiting to see if anyone was coming. She thought about her father's question asked on the phone the night before she arrived here. She thought about sitting on the edge of her bunk with the transfer form open, cursor blinking her hand over the submit button, and the name Elise Novak on a page in the middle of a notebook. She had her answer now. Not a clean one, not one that could be summarized in the language of citations and commendations, but an answer she understood in the way you understand things that have cost you enough to become permanent. It was worth it because Elise Novak deserved a record that did not end where the Army's record had ended. It was worth it because Danica Webb was 19 years old and had spent months managing a weight that should never have been hers to carry alone. It was worth it because Marcus Hale had waited 4 years in a maintenance bay for someone to show up and make the waiting mean something. It was worth it because Roy Ackerman had driven on a damaged knee to sit in a chair he had been waiting 6 years to sit in and had spoken for 31 minutes without notes and had walked out of that room with his cane and his dignity intact. It was worth it because systems do not change from the outside. They change when the people inside them, the ones who have seen the cost of silence and understood it precisely and chosen, despite that understanding, to stay, decide that the record is going to be complete this time. The pen moved across the page. Outside Fort Braddock had settled into its night. The drill yard on the east side of the base was dark and empty, and still the concrete holding the memory of a Tuesday morning in the way that places hold things, not in any document, not in any official file, but in the air itself, in the silence of a space where something irrevocable once happened and left its mark, not in the record books, but in the people who were standing there when it did. The base slept. At a desk with the lamp on, a woman with a scar on her left shoulder and a full notebook beside her and a new one in front of her kept writing. She had 5 names on the list, 5 bases, 5 sets of records that had not yet been read all the way through by someone with the patience and the knowledge to understand what they were reading. The system had not changed because she had broken a man's arm on a drill field in Texas. It had not changed because of one hearing, one verdict, one set of oak leaves pinned to a collar on a Friday morning while 300 soldiers stood in formation and remembered what they had seen. It had changed. It was changing because one person had decided that the record was going to be complete and had not stopped writing and had made it possible for others to stop being alone with what they knew. She had been right about one thing from the beginning. This was never going to be a short story. She turned to the next line. She kept going.